So then you guys, you had conferences. That was like what you're known for
Yeah.
so long, and then you kind of made a shift where, and this was kind of around the same time. So I was finishing my master's thesis,
Mm.
and I don't even know if you were part of this, but I remember talking to some Dare to Share staff, and at that time you had done that research for Gospelize that you
Yeah.
ended up
Yep.
publishing the book Gospelize, which we use and give to youth leaders all the time. And but they let me see some of that because I was like, who is doing this well? Like who is really
Yeah.
reaching? And it was part of like a problem that I was trying to solve, at our own church of, okay, I know the impact that the Lord can have, but we're not seeing that. Like what is working? What is, what, like where are we actually seeing things fire on all cylinders? And I didn't have the common excuses that other youth leaders did.
Mm.
I worked at a big church. I was full-time staff. I was trained. Like I had a youth ministry
Yep.
degree. I had a budget.
Yeah.
I even had other staff, and I was like, but I know that we're not making the impact that I believe that the Lord can have. And so what's the deal? And that's when I started learning about the gospel advancing ministry values. So we've talked about the values on here, but if you were just to describe some of the values or seven of the values, what, like, give a synopsis
Yeah.
of that for someone that might be new
Let
or need a refresher.
let me back it up if you don't mind just a little bit and tell you where they came from.
Yeah.
So we didn't develop them; we discovered them. We did that research project. The goal of the research project was not to discover the values. The goal of the research project, quite honestly, was I wanted to show to our donors and to youth leaders how effective our conferences were. But instead of finding that out, we found out that 76% of the students that left a Dare to Share event were actively sharing their faith. 6 months later, it was like 36%.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a 40% drop. So I was ticked. I was like, what the heck? We paid tens of thousands of dollars to find out our event is a 40% drop in effectiveness
Yeah.
6 months later. And our researcher was like, um, you know what? Number one, 36% of a youth group sharing their faith is not bad. Number two, if we find what were the common characteristics of the youth groups that did not see that massive drop.
Mm-hmm.
So we looked at a subset of this small group of, I think it was 10% of the groups saw 25% new conversion growth. So that basically after an event, they just kept growing or kept
Yeah.
going, right? They seemed to have seven things in common. So we kind of drew those to the top. I did a 10-city tour across the United States,
Mm-hmm.
from the East Coast to the West Coast, interviewed personally 1,000 pastors and youth pastors and roundtables, went over the seven values, double thumbs up, cross-checked it all with the book of Acts, all over the book of Acts, cross-checked it with the epistles, all over the epistles. So I ended up writing a book called Gospelize Your Youth Ministry, and it's based on the seven values as found in the book of Acts. So the seven values, very quickly, I just want to give a little background
Yeah,
on where they
absolutely.
kind of
It's
came
helpful.
from. So that's why I say we didn't develop these; we discovered them. And when you see them, you can't unsee them.
Mm-hmm.
Once you see them, you're like, "Oh my goodness, how did I miss
Yeah.
this?"
And with
Right?
that, it's like we talked about these like to youth leaders and like, okay, well, like share them, and then like they share them, like that's it, like
Yeah,
because they're
yeah.
obvious. Like you're like, hey, I've read the Book of Acts and I've seen these. Like, wait,
It's like that. Remember those pictures you used to stare at, and you try to stare and see the image in the picture, and then finally it would pop that 3D
yeah,
image. It's the same way as once you see it, you can't unsee it,
mm-hmm.
right? And so the first one is intercessory prayer fuels it. So the youth groups that reached the most of the lost prayed for the lost.
Mm-hmm.
They prayed that God would reach them and that God would open a door to their hearts. And so again, no duh, but that's not generally speaking a part of the
Yeah,
way we do youth ministry. Number two, relational evangelism drives it. So teenagers were equipped with gospel urgency, gospel fluency, some sort of gospel strategy.
mm-hmm.
Three is leaders fully embrace and model it. So the leaders were living this out of prayer and evangelism and disciple multiplication, and it was part of the way that they rolled,
Yeah,
starting with the youth leader, then the adult leaders, student leaders. Fourth, there was a disciple multiplication strategy that guided it.
mm-hmm.
So, they weren't all the same discipleship multiplication strategy, but there was something, a process in place to make sure it wasn't just converts, but disciples who make disciples. Fifth is a bold vision focuses it. So there was a bigger, bolder vision for what we call across the street, across the tracks, across the world,
Mm-hmm.
Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth. Six is biblical outcomes measure it. So they were measuring the right things, which is not attendance. It's things like new conversion growth, baptisms, gospel, number of gospel conversations, spiritual maturation points. And then seventh, ongoing programs reflect it.
Mm-hmm.
So that the programs of the youth leader reflected those priorities. They baked it in, and weren't just platitudes. They were true priorities
It
that
wasn't just
were
on their website. It was
wasn't just on
actually,
their
yeah.
website. It was on their program rundown and their calendar.
Yeah.
So those were the 7 values, and you know, they're real basic, but they're very, very effective. And as I look back when I pastored a church, we almost organically did a lot of those values because we were trained in a very intentional disciple multiplication, gospel advancing philosophy by the guy that reached my whole family for Christ. And when we planted the church, we did a lot of that. So we started the church with 23 people. When I left 10 years later, we had about 1,200 people, but over 62% of our congregation came to Christ from people reaching people with the gospel. And it's because a lot of these values, even though we hadn't named them yet, were just being done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
So
awesome.